So liquor flowed generously in speakeasies in the Roaring Twenty. Women kind of changed their outlook on things. They began wearing short hair, short skirts. They started driving vehicles. They smoked cigarettes. Women posed seductively in magazine advertisements, and the discussion of birth control was quite on the rise. During the 1920s, the economy absolutely boomed. There was a wealthy future for just about every citizen. At least if you were had a European Protestant background, anyway. Everyone invested in the stock market and they watched their wealth grow. House servants were told to take whatever money they could and invest it. And there was this notion of a belief in eugenics, and that remained very strong. More and more states were passing forced sterilization laws. Margaret Sanger, who championed birth control, was actually a very strong proponent of selected breeding. Prejudice against African Americans and Asians grew. Social Darwinism was now spiced with a euphoria for those who lived the good life. But African American culture was very much an oasis during the Roaring Twenties. The Great Migration of Black people to urban centers in the North, where industrial jobs provided an allure for those who wanted to escape the Southern culture. They found themselves in a cultural. They kind of created a cultural hub for themselves, which is known as the Harlem Renaissance. So African American writers and artists gained opportunities to pursue talents in less oppressive surroundings. There was very high level of black culture that had existed for a long time. However, white America had very much consistently ignored it. But Harlem provided an opening for black writers and artists, and they gained the attention of white patrons who provided an opportunity for publishing their works to a much broader audience. Middle class society, where white and black New Yorkers could mix in a very unusual way, occurred in Harlem. So these clubs, black musicians introduced and popularized jazz music, attracted a large white following, and we see where people like Duke Ellington and Fats Waller, Louis Armstrong, all of those really come out of the Harlem Renaissance. By the time the 1928 election came along, Coolidge really didn't have a desire to run again. So Republicans nominated Herbert Hoover. Hoover was a humanitarian, and he provided relief efforts during and after World War One in Europe. He orchestrated a very successful undertaking to feed the hungry in Western Europe, and those were called Hoover Meals. He was famous in Holland and Belgium, and there were statues of him in those countries. He accepted the nominee for the party for president with optimism for a future in the country. The economy, though, had reached absurd levels. The Democrats nominated Alfred E. Smith of New York. There was very little chance that voters would turn against the Republicans since the economy was booming. But the problem that Al Smith had was the fact that he was a Catholic. And if you really think about this, the United States will not have a Catholic president until 1960 when we see JFK take office. So really, just right there, he had very little chance of winning the presidency, because many felt that a Catholic president would be a slave to the Pope in Rome, and that rather than doing what was best for the United States, they would do what the Pope wanted. Hoover supporters, though, they promised a chicken in every pot, a car in every driveway, and it was an absolute easy victory for Hoover. I mean, if you look at this map, um, Smith took very few states, and ironically, he takes the South, which is kind of interesting with him being a Catholic. But but Hoover was highly intelligent. He was compassionate, and he was an extraordinary organizer. So when the economic crash of 1929 hits, um, people actually really thought that Hoover would do a great job with the Great Depression. We will pick up on the Great Depression next week, since that's where your reading kind of stops for this week. But Hoover, given the circumstances with what he had, the market busted, and it was due to a very unstable international debt, declining exports, and then, of course, the banking collapsed. And of course, always the president is the person to blame for those things, even though this happened immediately after he took office. So what Hoover ended up coming into was something that had been, the market can only go so long before it explodes. I mean, that's all there is. So this had been coming for some time, that it was just going to erupt. But the Great Depression leaves absolute economic chaos, and it lingered for most of the 1930s. So we will pick up there next week.